You were paid to take care of him. Don't confuse that with something more meaningful than it is. Miss Sloane. After today, this house runs on a different schedule. The people who've gotten too comfortable here, that arrangement is going to change. Servants don't belong among the guests.
Camille Sloane had spent months reducing Loretta Gaines to a job title, reminding her of her place with the ease of someone who had never been told no. What Camille hadn't bothered to learn was who Loretta actually was to this family, and what those steady hands had carried Adrian through. The guests saw an old woman absorbing an insult in silence. They missed the part where she didn't flinch. In rooms like this one, people who don't flinch are rarely the ones without power. Would Camille realize her mistake before the night was over? If you're new here, this channel tells the stories people carry quietly for years. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. The Bellamy Grand had been booked out entirely for the occasion, every ballroom and corridor folded into the architecture of a single event. Outside, a fleet of florists had been working since dawn, threading white orchids through steel frames that had cost more than most people's annual salary. Adrian Bellamy had built this hotel 11 years ago with borrowed capital and a reputation for cold, precise decisions. Now it was the backdrop of what the society pages were already calling the wedding of the summer. And he stood in the center of it all, watching a woman straighten a vase of lilies that didn't need straightening simply because she needed somewhere to put her hands. That woman was Loretta Gaines, and she had been putting her hands to work inside the Bellamy household for nearly 3 decades. She wasn't young anymore. She moved with the deliberate ease of someone who had spent years learning not to rush, which people often mistook for slowness. Adrian had never made that mistake. He knew what her pace meant, that she was thinking, observing, deciding whether what she was looking at was worth her words. He had grown up reading that particular quality of hers the way other children learn to read weather. When Loretta moved slowly, she was paying attention to something no one else had noticed yet. She had been the one to sit with him the night his mother died when he was 8 years old, and the house felt like it had been hollowed out. She hadn't tried to fill the silence with comfort he wasn't ready for. She had simply stayed. That was Loretta's way presence, without pressure, attention, without performance. Adrian had spent years in boardrooms learning to project the opposite, and he often wondered in quieter moments which approach had actually built more lasting things. Tessa had grown up in that house too, 4 years younger than Adrian brought in, when her own circumstances left her with nowhere else to land. The Bellamy household wasn't a formal arrangement. It was just what happened when Loretta was the kind of person who did not know how to look the other direction. Tessa had been difficult at 12, defiant at 16, and fiercely perceptive ever since. She and Adrian were not siblings by blood or paperwork, but by the quieter kind of accounting. The shared meals, the arguments, the long silences on car rides, they hadn't spoken about since. The wedding was Tessa's least favorite subject. She had said so not once but several times in the careful language of someone trying to be heard without being dismissed. She did not dislike Camille Sloane in the way of personal preference or old rivalry. She disliked what she had seen, and what she had seen was specific. Camille was precise and completely aware of how a room oriented itself around her. She came from the kind of family whose name appeared on buildings, which meant she had spent her life learning how to manage what was visible and what was not. In public around Adrian, she was warm and well-measured. She asked about Loretta with concern that sounded genuine. But Tessa had been in rooms where Adrian wasn't, and she had watched the way Camille spoke when she didn't need to perform for anyone. She had heard Camille tell Loretta to use the staff entrance at a charity dinner 2 months prior. She had seen Loretta's name removed from the family photograph list for the engagement shoot, blamed on the photographer's constraints. and she had watched Loretta absorb each of these small redirections without complaint, which worried Tessa far more than any argument would have. The women who accepted that kind of treatment quietly were usually the ones who had decided for the sake of someone they loved to bear it without burdening that person with the knowledge of what they were carrying. The seating chart incident happened the day before the ceremony. Kira, the event coordinator, who had been managing the logistics of the wedding for 5 months, was working through the final table arrangements when Camille appeared at the door of the planning room. Kira had developed a personal policy of not involving herself in family dynamics. That policy had served her well through a long career of managing events for people with money and complicated relationships. What she had not anticipated was Camille asking her to move Loretta Gaines from the front row to the rear section reserved for hired staff. Kira looked at the chart, then at Camille, then back at the chart. The arrangement had been approved personally by Adrian 6 weeks ago. Loretta's name was in his handwriting in the margin, with a note that read simply, "Front row, family side." She told Camille this as neutrally as she could. Camille's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. She said that priorities had a way of shifting when a new household was being established, and that she sincerely hoped Kira wasn't the kind of person who made her work difficult over something so logistical. The implication about Kira's contract was not subtle. Kira thought about her mother for a moment, not as an abstraction, but specifically. She thought about the Tuesday evening her mother had called her from a parking lot 22 years into a position with a box of personal items and a handshake. She recognized the mechanism she was looking at. She told Camille the seating would remain as approved by Mr. Bellamy. Tessa found out and went to find Camille directly, which was the kind of move Tessa made when she had decided that careful no longer applied. Camille was collected. She explained that she was not trying to be unkind. She was simply trying to maintain an appropriate environment for an event that included investors and board members who expected a certain order. She said Loretta's role had been important, but that there were contexts where certain boundaries existed for everyone's benefit. Tessa told her that Loretta had raised Adrian, that she was not a category to be organized, she was the reason he knew how to treat people at all. That was the moment Adrian walked in. He stood in the doorway long enough to understand the shape of what was happening, and then he did the thing that had become his default. In situations like this, he moved toward the center of it and tried to redistribute the tension rather than resolve the cause. He put a hand on Tessa's arm. He asked Camille if they could handle this after the walkthrough. He said that tomorrow was a significant day and that he hoped they could carry it without carrying all of this too. Tessa looked at him with an expression that had nothing defensive in it anymore. She had moved past the register of wanting to fight and arrived somewhere quieter and harder, the look of someone who had made a prediction they wished they'd been wrong about. She said she would see him at dinner and left without another word. Camille, sensing that the balance had shifted in her direction, offered Adrian a look that combined relief with the faintest suggestion that she had been the unreasonably treated party. He responded with the warmth of a man who genuinely wanted peace, which was, Tessa would have told him if he'd asked exactly how people like Camille learned what they could get away with. That evening, when the hotel had gone quieter, Loretta found Adrian standing at the window of the small sitting room adjacent to his suite. She knocked on the open door and turned. She was carrying 2 cups of tea. She had never arrived anywhere empty-handed. She set one cup on the table near him and took her own to the chair across from the window. She didn't say anything about what had happened in the corridor. She asked him whether he had eaten anything since the afternoon walkthrough. He had not. She told him there were sandwiches left from the catering test in the kitchen. He sat down instead. They stayed like that for a while, occupying the same room without needing to fill it. It was one of the things Adrian missed most when he thought about what his life had become: rooms that required constant occupation Noise, performance, the sense that silence between two people meant something had gone wrong. Eventually, Loretta asked him a question in the even tone she used when she had been deciding whether to say something for a long time. She asked whether he wanted to marry Camille because he loved her or because he had gone far enough down the road that turning around felt more costly than continuing. Adrian looked at his cup. He didn't offer any of the explanations he had rehearsed, perhaps because none of them sounded adequate in this particular room, in front of this particular person who had spent 2 decades listening to the difference between what he meant and what he said. He told her he thought it would get easier. Loretta finished her tea and stood. At the door, without turning back, she said that people often confuse the feeling of being too far in to quit with the feeling of being in the right place. The two feelings, she said, are not the same, and it is worth knowing which one you are sitting with before you walk down an aisle in front of everyone you know. Then she left. Adrian sat at the window for a long time after. He thought about the merger that the Sloan family's financial network would support, and the board members flying in from 4 cities, and the press release his team had already drafted. He thought about how much architecture had already been built around this decision, and how dismantling it would require a kind of certainty he wasn't sure he had. He told himself he was not choosing wrong. He told himself every relationship required adjustment. He told himself the wedding was tomorrow, and the time for large questions was behind him. He did not believe all of it, but he believed enough to stay. The morning of the wedding arrived the way mornings do after nights that don't allow for real sleep, gray at the edges, too bright, once the curtains moved. The hotel had been running since 5 in the morning, catering staff in the lower kitchen's florists making final adjustments in the ballroom, a quiet army of people whose names no one at the reception would learn. Loretta had been up before most of them. She dressed carefully, the way she always did for occasions that mattered to her, and she carried with her a small velvet box she had kept in the same drawer for 9 years. She knocked on the door of the bridal suite at 8:30. Camille was seated at the vanity in a silk robe watching herself be assembled in the mirror with the focused attention of someone overseeing a project. Loretta waited until the stylist had stepped back before she approached. She set the velvet box on the vanity and explained what it was not to perform sentiment, but because the object required it. The brooch had belonged to Adrian's mother. She had pressed it into Loretta's hands in the final weeks before she passed, asking her to give it one day to the woman Adrian chose to build his life with. It was not valuable by the standards of a room like this one. It was valuable by different standards entirely. Camille opened the box. She looked at the brooch with the expression of someone assessing an item at an estate sale, cataloging it quickly, dismissing it efficiently. She said it was a beautiful gesture, but that her dress had been designed around a specific visual line, and that adding a piece like this would complicate the silhouette. She thanked Loretta in the tone people use when they are ending a conversation. Loretta picked up the box, thanked her in return, and left the room. What happened next, Camille did not expect to be witnessed. By the time Kira arrived 10 minutes later with the updated ceremony timeline, the velvet box was in the small trash can beside the door, placed there. Kira understood immediately, with full awareness of what it was. Kira kept her attention on the logistics question she had come to resolve. But before she left, she noticed something else on the desk, a printed document with the Bellamy household letterhead across the top, and a list of names under a heading that read, Personnel Transition Post-Ceremony. The first name on the list was Loretta Gaines. Paper-clipped to the back was a confirmation from a residential care facility 40 minutes outside the city. A room had been reserved. The move-in date was listed as 3 days after the wedding. Kira took her phone from her pocket and photographed every page. She was almost at the door when Camille returned from the adjoining bathroom and saw her. What followed was not loud. Camille was too controlled for volume. She spoke in the register she reserved for situations that required precision rather than force. She said that Kira had just photographed private planning documents, that this could be characterized legally as theft of confidential material, and that she intended to characterize it exactly that way if any portion of those images was shared with anyone connected to this event. Kira looked at her steadily. She said she needed to check the floral placement in the east corridor, and that the timeline would be delivered to Mr. Bellamy's suite within the hour. Then she walked out, her phone in her pocket, her hands entirely steady. The ceremony was 2 hours away when Tessa found the velvet box. She had gone to the bridal suite to return a piece of jewelry that Camille's assistant had left in the family staging room, and the assistant had let her in without thinking. Tessa was turning to leave when she saw the small velvet box sitting in the trash can near the door. She recognized it immediately. She had seen Loretta carry it carefully out of the house on several occasions over the years, always bringing it back again, waiting. She picked it up. She opened it. The brooch was inside, undamaged, still in its original satin lining. Tessa went to find Camille and asked directly how the brooch had ended up in the trash. She asked it in a way that made clear she already understood the answer and was giving Camille the opportunity to say something that might change her understanding. Camille didn't take that opportunity. She said Loretta had a habit of placing herself at the center of Adrian's life in ways that weren't healthy, and that this particular gesture was an example of using a dead woman's memory to establish emotional leverage on a day that was supposed to belong to Adrian and Camille alone. The conversation escalated. Camille stopped being careful. She said that after today, the household would be run differently, and that anyone who had grown too comfortable treating the family's private space as their own permanent territory would need to adjust. She said she did not intend to spend her marriage navigating a household where the staff had more emotional access to her husband than she did. That was when Adrian came in. He had heard the elevated quality of the exchange from the hallway. He stood in the doorway and found Tessa holding the velvet box, and Camille looking at him with the expression of someone who had been interrupted and expected him to restore the order she'd been maintaining. The account that came from Camille was coherent, sympathetic, and arranged to position her as someone who had tried to decline a gift gracefully and been pursued into conflict. She said it while her eyes filled at exactly the right moment. The overall effect was of a woman who had been misunderstood by a family that had never truly welcomed her. Adrian held the velvet box in his hands and looked at it. He knew what it was. He knew who had asked Loretta to keep it and what it was meant to represent. He also knew the ceremony was in less than 2 hours and that 312 people were already in the building below. He felt the weight of both things pressing in opposite directions, and he did what he had been doing for months. When this pressure appeared, he tried to find the place between them where neither required a definitive answer. He asked both of them to stop. He said the ceremony would proceed on schedule and that everything else could be addressed when there was more space around it. Tessa looked at him. She had run out of the kind of disappointment that expresses itself as anger. What she showed him now was quieter, the face of someone who had wanted specifically and genuinely to be wrong. She set the velvet box on the table beside her carefully and walked out without asking anything of him. Loretta had been in the corridor when the voices were loudest, and she heard enough to understand what had been said. She went to the side table where Tessa had left the velvet box and picked it up herself. She put it in her bag and said to no one in particular that there are truths people only see when they're ready to pay for them. The ceremony began at 2 in the afternoon. The ballroom held everyone the Bellamy name could draw in one room: 312 investors, board members, journalists, family, and the entirety of the Sloan network. The room was exactly what it had been designed to be, a display flawless and expensive, and specifically arranged to communicate permanence. Loretta was where Adrian had placed her front-row family side. During the mingling before the processional, Loretta moved toward Adrian, who was speaking with one of his board members near the edge of the family section. She reached up briefly to straighten the pocket square on his jacket, the kind of thing a person does without thinking when they have dressed someone they love for every important occasion of their life. The gesture lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Camille saw it from across the room. She crossed the space between them without rushing, which was worse in its way than if she had. She arrived at Loretta's side with a composed expression and said loudly enough for the nearest tables to hear that the seating in the family section was for guests and that perhaps Loretta would be more comfortable with the rest of the catering team. Loretta said calmly that Mr. Bellamy had placed her in the family section himself. Camille surveyed the people nearby, taking inventory of who was watching, and said that she understood Loretta had formed a deep attachment to Adrian over many years, but that attachment was not the same as family, and that what had been paid for and what had been felt were two different categories of relationship that it was important not to confuse. The nearest tables had gone quiet. Tessa appeared at the edge of the group and told Camille that was enough. Camille picked up a glass of red wine from the nearest table. Later, people would disagree about whether she had stumbled, but the disagreement lasted only as long as it took them to watch what came next. The wine left the glass entirely across the front of Loretta's cream-colored dress, up along her shoulder, down the side of her face and into her silver hair. The room went silent in the specific way that happens when something crosses a line everyone recognized, but no one expected. Camille looked at Loretta and said that this was why the serving staff belonged in the back. Adrian was 4 steps away. He turned and saw Loretta standing in the ruin of what had been a careful, considered choice of dress for the most important day in the life of a person she loved. He saw 312 people looking at him. He saw Camille looking at him. He saw Tessa at the edge of the crowd, her face completely still. And he said nothing. The silence stretched only a few seconds, but it was long enough to matter. Loretta reached up without hurry and removed the small pin from her lapel, the Bellamy family crest, which Adrian had given her years ago as a quiet acknowledgement of who she was to him. She took his hand, turned it over, and placed the pin in his palm. She closed his fingers around it gently, the way you return something to the person it truly belongs to. Then she looked at him not with anger, not with accusation, but with the particular sadness of someone who had hoped for his sake to be wrong about this moment. She said that she had spent her life teaching him how to be a good man, and that perhaps the rest of it he would have to learn on his own. Then she walked out. Tessa followed without a word or a backward glance. The ballrooms did not recover from what had happened. The musicians resumed after a few bars of silence. The catering staff resumed moving with their trays, and the guests resumed the surface behavior of people at a social event. But beneath all of it, the room had changed its quality the way a room does after something has been said that cannot be unsaid. The journalists who had arrived to cover a society wedding understood that they were now covering something else entirely. Camille had retreated briefly, then returned to the staging area near the processional entrance, composed fully assembled in the architecture of the occasion, the dress and veil arranged with the precision of someone who had been preparing for this moment for months. She believed Adrian would walk out and take his place because the alternative was a public unraveling that neither of them could afford. She had correctly assessed the weight of that pressure on him for the better part of a year. What she had not accounted for was Kira. Adrian was standing at the far edge of the staging area, the family crest pin still in his closed hand, when Kira appeared at his side. She didn't ask for his attention or precede what she was doing with any explanation. She held out her phone with the photographs already on the screen and waited for him to look. He looked. The document was clear and left nothing open to interpretation. The personnel transition list with Loretta's name at the top. The care facility confirmation with its move-in date 3 days after the wedding. And at the back, the message Camille had sent to her assistant, brief, specific, written with the confidence of someone who expected it to be carried out without question. Adrian read it twice. Then something settled in his face, not hardness exactly, but the specific clarity that arrives when a person stops negotiating with themselves about what they are seeing and simply sees it. The wine on Loretta's dress had not been impulsive. The plan had been in place before the ceremony. What he had spent months interpreting as friction between two people who hadn't yet learned how to share space had been from the beginning a campaign patient, methodical, and aimed at a woman who had never defended herself because she was too busy protecting him from knowing about it. The processional music began. Camille came through the entrance at the far end of the ballroom, and the guests rose and the room oriented itself entirely around her. She walked with the composed assurance of someone who had won. She had calculated Adrian's decision correctly, based on everything she knew about who he had been. She had not accounted for the fact that the pin in his hand had changed something. Adrian was standing at the front of the room when she arrived beside him. The officiant moved to begin, and then Adrian spoke first into the microphone positioned for the ceremony, which meant his voice reached every person in the room without effort. He asked Camille directly, and without preamble, whether she had arranged for Loretta to be moved to a residential facility after the wedding without telling him. The room went very still. Camille said no with the practiced evenness of someone who had a response ready. She said she didn't know what he'd been told or by whom, but that she would not stand at the altar and be accused of something on the basis of rumor. Adrian connected his phone to the display system that had been set up for the wedding video. The photographs appeared on the large screen behind the altar. The personnel list, the care facility reservation, the message to the assistant visible to all 312 people simultaneously. The sound that moved through the crowd was not loud. It was the particular sound of a room adjusting its understanding of what it was witnessing. Camille looked at the screen and then at Adrian, and she made a decision. She stopped being the person who had been falsely accused and became the person willing to defend her position openly. She said she had been trying to build a life with him, and that building a life required making decisions about what that life would look like. She said Loretta's role had always been a professional arrangement that had simply been allowed to run longer than these things typically did. She framed it as protecting their future, and if he wanted to make a scene out of that in front of every person who mattered to his business, she could not stop him. She gave him the choice the way she had always framed it, the woman who had cared for him in the past, or the woman who would build the future with him. Adrian looked at the screen, then at Camille, then at the space of faces arranged between them. He thought about the board members, the merger conversations, the press release already queued. He thought about the weight of all the things he had not said over the past year, and all the things Loretta had absorbed on his behalf, and the way she had placed a small pin into his open hand, as though releasing him from a debt she had never asked him to carry. He said that the woman who had raised him was not his past. She was the reason he had a future worth anything at all. He set the wedding ring on the surface in front of him next to the microphone. He told the room the ceremony was over. Camille's response was not quiet. She told him the Bellamy Corporation would feel the consequences that the Sloan family's network extended through every financial relationship his company depended on, and that he would spend years rebuilding what he had destroyed today. She said it with the conviction of someone accustomed to those words carrying real weight. Adrian asked the security team to assist the Sloan family to their vehicles. Before he left the stage, he turned back to the guests who remained. He did not attempt to manage the narrative or redirect attention. He said that what had happened to Loretta in that room was the result of decisions Camille's and his own. He said he had seen what was happening for months and had chosen more than once to stay quiet because quiet felt like preservation. He said that his silence was not neutral and that Loretta would remember it long after she forgot anything else about today. Then he stepped down. He found Tessa in the corridor behind the main ballroom, standing near a window that overlooked the hotel's east garden. She had not left the building, as though some part of her had been waiting to find out what the afternoon was going to cost. When Adrian came through the door, she turned and looked at him without speaking. He told her she had been right. He said it without softening or adding context. She had been right from the beginning, and he had made her carry that knowledge alone, and he was sorry. Tessa asked him one question, whether he was going to go find Loretta. He said yes. She looked at him for a moment, with the expression of someone reopening a door they had thought about closing permanently. She told him to go. It was not forgiveness completed, but it was a door reopened, and with Tessa that was more than he had any right to expect. The train station near the Bellamy Grand was small 4 platforms, a waiting area with wooden benches, a ticket window that closed at 9 in the evening. Adrian had passed it hundreds of times without registering it as the kind of place where anything significant would happen. He walked in and found Loretta on the second bench from the entrance, sitting with her bag on her lap and her coat folded beside her, waiting for a train that was still 20 minutes out. The stain on her dress had dried to a darker version of itself. He sat down on the bench beside her. He didn't speak first. He waited the way he had waited beside her in 100 different rooms since he was 8 years old. Loretta looked at the platform ahead of them, then asked what he was doing there. He told her he hadn't come to ask her to forget what had happened. He told her he'd come because he wanted her to know that when he had stood there in silence, it hadn't been because he didn't see. He had seen everything. He had simply been more afraid of losing the shape of his life than of losing the people who had made it worth anything. Loretta was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked what he wanted. He said he wanted the chance to live differently. Not to repair what had happened with a gesture or a statement or something with her name on it. He understood those things had a place, but that place was after the living differently, not instead of it. Loretta looked at him with the quality of attention she had always given him, the kind that didn't rush to interpretation, that waited until it was sure it understood what it was looking at. She told him she would not be returning to the house as before. She needed her own space, not because she didn't love him, but because she needed to know she was somewhere, because she chose to be there. She needed that distinction, and it wasn't a small one. Adrian said he understood. The sound of a distant train moved through the station. Loretta reached into her bag and removed the velvet box. She set it on the bench between them, then looked at him directly. She said she had carried it for 9 years and did not intend to carry it forever. But she was not going to give it back to him tonight. She told him to hold on to the pin she had returned to him today, and when he had proved by the way he lived, not by what he said, that he understood what it represented, then they would talk about what came next. Then she stood, gathered her coat, and picked up her bag. She left the velvet box on the bench. Adrian understood. He picked it up carefully, held it alongside the pin already in his hand, and sat there as the platform emptied and the sound of the train faded into the distance. Several months later, the Bellamy Corporation held a quiet opening ceremony for a new community center in the western district of the city. The building was modest by Bellamy standards, a converted warehouse thoughtfully renovated with a garden along the south side that received afternoon light. It provided housing support, healthcare navigation, and financial planning, specifically for professional caregivers, nannies, household managers, home health workers who had spent their careers inside other people's lives and arrived at the end with no infrastructure of their own. The center bore the name Loretta Gaines above its entrance in letters that were neither small nor ostentatious. Kira was there. Adrian had sent the invitation personally. When he found her near the garden entrance, he told her that she had done the thing he should have been able to do himself and that he was grateful. She said that her mother would have wanted to know that something like this existed. That was all either of them needed to say about it. Tessa stood beside Adrian during the remarks. She had not returned to exactly who she had been with him before. Trust, once it has been broken and begun to repair, is not the same object it was. But she was there, which she had chosen deliberately, and her presence said what she was not yet ready to put into words. Loretta lived now in a small house near a garden she had always wanted. Her room in the Bellamy house remained as it had been, not preserved as a gesture, but because it was hers, and Adrian had finally understood that this had always been true. On the evening of the opening, after the guests had moved inside, Adrian and Loretta sat together on a bench along the garden path. He reached into his coat pocket and took out two things, the family crest pin and the velvet box. He opened the box and held the brooch toward her without ceremony. Then he turned his other hand over and offered her the pin alongside it. Loretta looked at both objects in his outstretched hands for a long moment. Then she took the brooch and pinned it to her own lapel, the way a person handles something that belongs to them. She took the pin next and held it for a moment, turning it once between her fingers. Then she pinned it beside the brooch on the same lapel and smoothed them both flat with two fingers, the way she had always smoothed his pocket square, carefully, without hurry, the way she did everything that mattered. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The two pins sitting side by side on her lapel said what words would have taken longer to reach. Adrian looked at her in the late afternoon light. He said he had once believed that success meant accumulating enough control that the hard choices eventually disappeared. Loretta told him that what he had described was not success. She said the actual thing was knowing what was worth choosing before you ran out of time to choose it correctly. He looked at her for a moment, and then he said the only thing left to say. He said it was time to go home. And Loretta smiled, not the smile of someone who had been won back, but of someone who had never stopped knowing exactly where home was. She had simply been waiting for him to find his way back to it. If this story stayed with you, it's because some part of you recognized it, maybe in someone you love, or in a choice you're still sitting with. That's what these stories are for. Subscribe if you want more of them. There's always another one worth telling. There are people in our lives who show up quietly, who don't announce what they've given, or keep score of what they've carried. They stay and they teach, and they absorb far more than they should ever have to, because they love someone who isn't yet paying close enough attention. This story is a reminder to pay attention before it costs you everything. It's a reminder that the people who raised us, who stayed when staying was hard, who smoothed the edges of who we were becoming, they are not background. They are not category. They are not past. They are the reason we have anything worth protecting in the present. And it's a reminder that silence when someone we love is being diminished in front of us is not neutrality. It is a choice. And it is felt. If there's someone in your life who has given you that kind of quiet, steady love, don't wait for a dramatic moment to show them you know what it was worth. You don't need a wedding or a cancellation or a platform with a microphone. You just need to say it today while there's still time. If this reached you, share it with someone it might reach too. And if you're new here, subscribe. These are the stories that remind us what actually matters.